Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to see you online. It would be nicer to be in person, but I really would like to commend the efforts of friends from the University of Georgia Security Platform, who've made such a huge effort in organizing this conference and giving us an opportunity to discuss against all odds at this really trying time. So welcome on this panel, which is the last of a dynamic and exciting afternoon. I know that every panel moderator would say that, but I really have a stellar combination of panelists. So welcome to all of you. Each of you, of course, will have between 8 and 10 minutes to give their own presentation, and then we will open the floor for discussions, and I would welcome questions coming from the audience online. So please, for the general public, if you do have questions, put them forward and we will pick them at the end of the discussion. I'm Rosaria Puglisi. I'm the head of the NATO Liaison Office in Georgia. We cover also, the South Caucasus in general, and I hope you will forgive me if I start by sharing with you the position of the alliance in relation to the Black Sea. There is one element that we really need to start from, and we really need to be aware of the fact that the security of the Black Sea is interconnected and intertwined with the wider Euro-Atlantic security. For NATO, security in the Black Sea is central. We have 3 allies who are littoral countries and 2 key partners who are littoral countries. From this point of view, it's kind of clear, I don't have to explain anyone, that we do have a distinct interest in making sure that the Black Sea remains an area of peace, stability, where trade and exchanges take place on the basis of international law only. Of course, we look with great concern at the developments that we have witnessed in the last few years, especially since the spring of 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the build-up of Russian military forces in the region, with obstruction to free navigation and the extension of a military presence. We see this as part of a widened pattern of provocation that goes from the Barents to the Baltic Sea, from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. And it's in this perspective that, taking into account the realities on the ground, NATO has enhanced its presence in the Black Sea and has enhanced the cooperation with partners, with Georgia and Ukraine in particular. So we have set in place the deterrence and defense posture through the tailored forward presence. This means that there are more initiatives on land, on air, and at sea. This has allowed us to improve our collective capacity to work together. And overall, NATO is active with more ships, with more naval exercises, and in the air, we have reinforced efforts to protect NATO airspace as well as enhance the situation awareness. Now, I mentioned earlier on that we have 2 key partners, Ukraine and Georgia, that are, of course, littoral countries of the Black Sea, and we have also increased cooperation with them because we feel that this is mutually beneficial. It's not just symbolic, but it was really important that last year, in fact, actually to the day, we had 2 important visits by the North Atlantic Council, first in Batumi at the beginning of October, and then later on in Odessa. it was important to give an indication to these two partners that we are here to help and support them in developing their own defense capacity. So we have, with time, we have increased our training capacity with the Georgian Coast Guard, for example. This has helped us improve our capacity, our interoperability, our capacity to work together. We're planning also to strengthen this cooperation through the substantial NATO Georgia package. So we expect a number of measures to take place. You will probably know that already in the spring of last year and this year again, the NATO foreign ministers endorsed packages to strengthen cooperation with Georgia. So we are seeing increased engagement on relations on issues like port and harbor security and enhanced maritime situation awareness. In short, NATO remains strongly committed to security in the Black Sea, and this is an issue that was reiterated as it was last week when the Secretary General met Prime Minister Gacharia. And the discussion, the issue was discussed to share more air traffic radar with Georgia, to work regionally to address hybrid threats, and to do joint exercises in the Black Sea. So we are preparing for that. All this said, let me open the floor to colleagues who are joining us from different corners in the world. I think, I mean, the idea is to basically start from issues that are more kind of wide and general on the Black Sea, and then move down to more country-specific interests. So I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Dimitrios Triafillou from the Kadir Has University. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. And you need to unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll try to give a general overview and maybe raise more questions and have answers as somebody who has been studying and focusing and writing about the Black Sea region in general and security for a long time. Now, in May 2010, Mustafa Aydin, who is also part of this panel, and I published a report of the Commission on the Black Sea when we titled it a 2020 Vision for the Black Sea region, where we highlighted the potential of the region and stakeholders to change the dynamics towards a wider cooperative security community. And in particular, we highlighted the following priorities. One, we talked about enhancing the profile of Black Sea regionalism, where we also talked about institutional regionalism, such as the BSEC and other organizations, and the need to enhance them, enhancing region-wide awareness, and so on. Then we had a second sort of priority there, which is dealing with the conflicts. And we suggested there's a need to focus on this at the region-wide level, prioritize CBMs and a number of other instruments that are necessary. And we are still dealing with the conflicts. Then we talked about focusing on economic issues that meet common challenges and real needs, where we actually, maybe ahead of our times, I was going through the report today and we were talking about prioritizing things linked to sustainable development, climate change, and so on, as generators of economic reform and growth in the region. Then we talked about promoting and coordinating regional cooperation schemes at all levels, as well as interregional and intra-regional focus. We talked about promoting intercultural dialogue, which is a sort of a term to also cover interfaith dialogue, cooperation between universities, and so on. I mean, we were really thinking about a regional approach together with other colleagues. We talked about promoting the targeted training of professional groups, and this has to do with, because we have had some experience at the time, involvement, especially with the BSEC, with what we thought and felt was the quality of the human resources needed to be improved. And so we even suggested maybe the founding of a Black Sea Training Academy to improve the quality of human resources across the region, and of course also enhance cooperation. And finally, we talked about promoting good governance, civil society, and social dialogue. Now, 10 years on, much of what we highlighted might sound utopic and unfeasible, yet much has been done, and it's being done in the direction that we envisioned. But nevertheless, the region is in flux. And I was looking back at my writings over this 10 years, and I keep bringing up the term flux. The region is in flux at different times since 2010, whenever I've written an extended article about the region. And I've been trying to understand the flux. And the problem is that all this progress or potential progress that we assumed was there, the potential of it was there, has been hijacked by the evolving political context and security considerations. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. And it's also compounded by a wider transformative process of the international order, with the global shifts from a rule-based international order, which the EU, for example, as an actor, still favors, and defends, to an increasingly multipolar order, where the other poles, or such even the United States in that sense, Russia and China, among others, ever more define their role within the lenses of great power competition, is something to take into account. And the advent of multipolarity also implies the emergence of other poles, countries and states, and I'll get to this in a second, how this affects the Black Sea region, that also want to be considered a pole, with implications for their current alliance status and orientation. So this fluidity of the international order and the emergence of a number of power vacuums generate the need to rethink and reformulate security as well as act upon it. And if we are really into this process, the flux is explained by a systemic change, because we are talking about systemic change, from a multilateral, as I said, rules-based order to a multipolar, competitive sort of order, where the poles do not necessarily interact with each other. Then this transformation is something we have to consider. Undeniably, the Russian factor remains a primary concern, and we've heard this throughout this afternoon from speakers in the previous panels, in particular, both as a disruptor of the European regional security order and as a strategic actor with its own vital interests. Another concern, and something we have not really talked about, even though some people have alluded to it, some colleagues have alluded to it, is the state of intra-alliance dynamics, which are currently frayed, in particular with regard to Turkey's relations with some of its allies, thereby impacting directly on NATO's ability or inability for a more enhanced role in the Black Sea region. And also as well on regional developments, such as the latest iteration of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I mean, we just heard our moderator tell us how NATO is doing more and more in the region. The thing is, this has been a discussion which is longstanding. And NATO should have been a much bigger actor, given the fact that you have, as we well heard, 3 literal states that are NATO member states and 2 states that actually very openly would like to join the alliance. And there's a big debate about whether they should have already been alliance members or not. So this is something that we need to take into account. And Turkey is important in this context, because I keep going back through the conversations we heard even in the previous panel and the first panel. We talk about Russia, we talk about the West, then Turkey comes in, and it's not very clear as to whether Turkey acts as part of the alliance, or it acts on its own, or it acts as a pole. And this is something to take into account. And therefore, I would state that Turkey finds itself in a strategic drift towards a strategic reorientation, and therefore, the issues thereby raised in the abstract for this panel itself, an issue such as the installation of the Russian A2AD system in Crimea and the eastern shores of the Black Sea, the adherence of the freedom of navigation, and therefore the importance of the straits in that regard, and the desire to bring more stability and security via Europe and NATO in the South Caucasus, have also to be filtered through the lenses of whether all NATO member states are on the same chapter. And this is something that adds significance given the complexity of the context. The same applies to the role of the European Union. As I said before, the European Union is sticking its guns to rules-based multilateralism. And the fact that we are in the midst of systemic change, the EU's influence and its ability to influence is being challenged. While the EU is maintaining multilateralism within with its normative elements for internal cohesion among its member states. And of course, as well as to those aspiring to come closer to it, whether they're candidates for accession or EAP countries and so on and so forth. But it's also beginning to act or accepting the fact that it has to do more as a geopolitical actor, and hence what sort of geopolitical actor to meet the challenges that stem from an order where great power competition seems to be more the norm than the exception. Another factor in this, therefore, is also to consider is the perceived inability of maintaining the compartmentalization of the foreign policies of the regional states and greater powers. Because up to now, we've basically focused, there have been some exceptions talking about the wider, the regions that are linked to the Black Sea region, but we focused on the Black Sea region, we focused on the South Caucasus, but is that focus feasible? Even for analytical purposes, we have to rethink that a little bit. And so the linkages between the developments in the Black Sea region with those in other regions have become increasingly obvious in recent years, both in terms of maritime security, energy dynamics, and international trade. Turkey came to terms with it. Turkey, which always tried, for example, to compartmentalize its Black Sea policy to the Black Sea per se, and therefore put itself as a primary actor, as a local hegemon together with Russia to deal with the issues around the Mare Nostrum, has come to the realization over the last decade that Russia, well, I live in Istanbul and I have a colleague, well, Mustafa Aydin and I, we are at the same university, we have a colleague, Serhat Guvenç, who with a group of friends are amateur photographers, and they always take pictures of Russian ships of many sorts going through the straits, up and down, back into the Black Sea or leaving the Black Sea to sail down the Aegean to the Eastern Med, because Russia's increased involvement over there. And Turkey very much came to terms with this utopia of compartmentalization, especially with the increased activities of Russia in Syria, especially in the aftermath of the shooting down of the Russian Sukhoi attack aircraft in November 2015 in the Turkey-Syria border. All of a sudden, and since then, we have Turkey trying to compartmentalize the Black Sea from its theater of operation in Syria and the greater Middle East, found that there is a connection there and has had to deal with Syria in conjunction when it can with Russia. Likewise, developments in the Eastern Mediterranean suggest that this compartmentalization of policies can be no more, and no country, big or small, can think that they can only concentrate on issues in their particular region. You know, one might say, well, and I deal with the Eastern Mediterranean also. One might wonder why, but I have my interest. But there, the same issue is coming up. We have basically two NATO member states, Greece and Turkey, at odds for a variety of reasons, at odds. And not only at odds and supposedly up to now, both EU membership and EU membership for Greece and aspiration to join the EU for Turkey and NATO membership since 1952 for Greece and Turkey have acted as levers, putting under the carpet whatever tensions might emerge, or even the solution and sitting down actually resolving the differences that exist between the two countries. But in this latest edition of the tensions, which has prolonged as never before over the last few months, we've had a number of developments emerge. And one of them, which is interesting because there are reports now coming out, not only in the Greek press, but in the international press, is that on August 27th, as Greek fighter jets were coming back from an exercise I'm getting a message that my time is coming to an end. I'm almost finishing. Greek jets were coming back from an exercise, a multinational exercise. It was called Binomia, I think, together with French and Italian and Cypriot participation. Turkey activated its S-400 anti-aircraft systems to try to detect the jets. And this led the US to be more involved, with Pompeo going to Cyprus, coming to Greece, and setting off the new stage of enhanced relations between the US and Greece. And again, my concern is not so much, oh my goodness, Turkey is acting as a rogue. That's not the point. The point is, if Turkey is actually involved in the systemic change and it's becoming a pole of its own, then our focus should also be in trying to see how we can find a modus vivendi with Turkey in this regard. Now, and these aforementioned issues raise the question as to whether a regional security community or many sub-regional ones are possible under the current context. A penultimate thought also has to do with history. I mean, I'm currently reading Bruno Tetrais's excellent sort of essay on the revenge of history, La Revanche de l'Histoire. And if his thesis holds true, that we are witnessing is to a certain degree both historical and geographic determinism, we need to factor these in as well in our analysis. And I'm not talking here about necessarily the civilizational discourse. That is also something that's becoming prominent. I'm talking more about how geography and history does shape, especially in a systemic change where poles are emerging, it does shape sort of the discourse of these poles. Finally, how does the confluence of all these aforementioned trends and developments impact on our host country, in this case, Georgia, for example? After all, we have heard from many of the speakers this afternoon that Tbilisi has been meeting the criteria for NATO membership and should have actually already been a member. Of course, I agree, I've written about it. The question thus is whether NATO membership is a panacea, or actually it is the wrong question to ask, and as we need to focus again on the systemic tectonic shifts that we are experiencing and that have yet to reveal their endgame. And I think if we don't address the systemic change and the implications of it, just talking about NATO and the NATO presence and how it can act as a security actor, and it is acting, and dealing with, in particular, the Russian threat and its multifaceted threat, I think might not be enough for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitrios. I just would like to remind all participants that we have a large panel, so we need to make sure that we really stick to our time, which is 8-10 minutes. Can I please now call in Dr. Mustafa Aydin, who is the president of the International Relations Council of Turkey, and he also comes from the Kadir Has University. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosario. Let me start where Dimitris started. Actually, what he called flux, I call transition. And my first note about this panel was the transition of the Black Sea region and area in general is still continuing, which a transition that started by the end of the Cold War has not yet ended. And that transition is not only in the security area, but it's more widespread. It includes social, political, economic changes and transition, which of course affects the security aspect of the region. When you look at issues still continues. In the recent conflict flare up between Azerbaijan and Georgia, we still see this effect of nation and state building problems. On the political level, we have different types of governments, ranging from democracies to controlled regimes or democracies to authoritarian regimes. And economically, different shades of a free market economy and with state involvement happens at the same time around the Black Sea. So all of these changes keep changing also the balances within the region, which affect the security considerations. From specifically the security perspective, when you look at it, the western and southern shoreline of the Black Sea region has now more or less firmly embedded or included in the Western security system, be it within the as part of the NATO membership, or being member of the European Union, or any other transatlantic cooperation initiatives. Southern and the western shores of Black Sea is now more or less secured and part of a wider security system. However, we cannot say the same thing about the northern and eastern shoreline of the Black Sea, which are very much in what I call transition and what Dimitris calls in flux, and which makes it much more difficult to create a regional security system, or at least to induce a more stable security environment in the region, which of course also creates competitions and confrontations between those parts of the region which is firmly in going along with the Western system, and other parts that are not, or even sometimes against the Western security system. There was briefly, well, not briefly, there was actually quite a long time an attempt to create an indigenous regional security system in the wider Black Sea area with various regional institutions, biggest of which was the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, but also on the security aspect, Black Sea 4, etc. And there were other multilateral cooperation initiatives. But when you look at it overall, in the last 10 years, we could argue that this attempt at creating an indigenous security system around the Black Sea have failed, or at least stalled. Nothing is moving ahead at the moment. In fact, if you look at, again, from the security perspective, the security situation and the stability in the region has somewhat worsened in recent years. And the turning point, of course, it's easy to pinpoint, was the August 2008, the war between Georgia and Russia, and the ability or inability or the choices of the wider world to respond to that crisis, actually creating conditions that resulted in spring 2014 Ukrainian and Crimean crisis, which at the end nailed the coffin of Black Sea regional security system. So the failures of responding to August 2008 resulted what we are facing today. What happened in between and what we are facing today are three important aspects. One is that we have been facing an increased Russian assertiveness across the region, and more importantly, a militarization of the Black Sea region, which prevents or preempts any regional cooperation or region-wide cooperation initiatives, which prevents any states actually joining with Russia to talk about even on the security aspect of the region. So added to this, the second aspect is maybe the problematic issue is the shifting attention of the United States away from the Black Sea region. Admittedly, in last few years, and the US has been, and with the prompting of the United States, NATO also have been trying to make a kind of a comeback and trying to put together a response to Russian assertiveness in the region. But nevertheless, the shifting of attention is still there, and it's very clear as far as the United States perspective is concerned. Added to this is, of course, inability of the European Union to develop innovative ways of creating inroads in the region. In the early days of the post-Cold War era, there were several different initiatives, economically, politically, on the social aspect, on the transportation, on the environment, wide range of on the wide range of issues. There were several and different attempts from the European Union to engage with the region. This has declined in recent years, and the ability of the European Union to be one of the players in the region have been severely curtailed, even though it has expanded onto the shorelines of the European Union, of the Black Sea region. And third, of course, linked to this development is the weakening of balancing power of Turkey in the Black Sea. I will come back to this. This relates number of issues. It includes changing focus of Turkey, but also weakening of Turkish maritime power in the Black Sea, or increasing maritime power of Russia. However, whatever the reason of this, the end result is the weakening of balancing power of Turkey vis-a-vis Russia in the Black Sea have changed the Black Sea balances tremendously. The third issue that I think has been developing over the years is the inability of the international institutions and interested international actors to find solution to what some people still call frozen conflicts. Of course, the experts and the security people who are looking into the region have always been keep insisting that the conflicts have not frozen. They could at any moment unfrozen. Nevertheless, this is the kind of attitude towards the regional conflicts. So long they keep they remain as regional and do not directly affect the outsiders, the European Union, United States, the attention is quite low. This is one of the biggest obstacles for the sustained peace and stability in the region. Recent flare-up of Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has reminded us again this. When we look at I'm finishing within 1 minute. When we look at the current particulars of the regional developments from the security perspective, I think that the main, in the short term at least, the main determining factor will be Turkey, what I would call cooperative competition. Turkey is still, I think, the only a power in the region whose preferences to ally itself with one side or another would change the balances in the region. There is no other country in the region who could, single country in the region, who could presumably challenge Russia in its Black Sea policies. And of course, I'm not sure whether Turkey is willing to do that, but what I'm saying is Turkey is the only country whose choices would affect the balances tremendously. And when we look at the Turkey's policies, of course, it's apart from diverged focuses, it seems that Turkey is preferring at the moment to be as independent as possible in its foreign policy, instead of aligning itself with its traditional Western allies, and it seems also preferring transactional foreign policy moves, which includes the security area, and which eventually, in general sense, for the Black Sea context, affect the regional balances. I would argue that the balances in the region have shifted tremendously, and we have not yet come to an understanding or acceptance of this shift. And unless and until this balance is regained, there would not be a possibility of creating a more stable regional order. Therefore, I would argue that in the near future, we would see more competition, more conflict, rather than cooperation, especially in the security area. I think I have to stop here. Rosaria has come back.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry to play this annoying role, but we have so many panelists. So now this is the moment for Dr. Stephen Flanagan from Rand, US and Georgetown University. Thank you.
I'm ready, but waiting for the video to start. There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
Hear you. We can hear you. Good. And see you.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes. No, it said I was waiting for the sponsor to unmute me. Well, thank you, Dr. Puglisi. It's a pleasure to join you all, and congratulations to the University of Georgia Security Platform for organizing this important discussion. My remarks today will present the findings of a RAND report that several colleagues and I have prepared over the past 18 months, which purely coincidentally, and I do mean coincidentally, it was posted just this morning, and I'll share the link in the chat later. This report examines Russia's overall strategy in the Black Sea region and the impact of its malign activities, military buildup, and aggression on regional security. We then present options for how NATO and EU countries can work with allies and partners in the region to achieve a more effective countervailing Western strategy to protect mutual interests. Our assessment of Russia's strategy draws on official Russian policy statements, writing by Russian and international military and security analysts, and dialogues with Russian officials and experts at major conferences. On the Western side, we conducted dialogues with officials, military leaders, scholars, journalists in Europe and the United States, and we also benefited from a March 2019 workshop in Bucharest with 24 experts and former officials from Europe and the United States, co-sponsored by the German Marshall Fund in Bucharest and the Aspen, Romania, then headed by, of course, now Deputy Secretary General Mircea Joanna. So we're very pleased to have Alina, Naya, and Mircea as partners in this effort a bit. So first of all, a quick point, which I obviously barely need to make among this group. Why does the Black Sea matter? It is a region that is a central locus of the competition between Russia and the West for the future of Europe. As Georgians know all too well, the region has experienced 2 decades of simmering conflicts, even before Moscow's illegal annexation of Crimea and initiation of the war in eastern Ukraine. Russia has used military force, of course, 4 times in the region since 2008. Yet despite this instability and the conflicts in the region, US and European officials and analysts have not, at least when we started this project, had not given nearly as much attention to security challenges as they had to other areas of Europe, particularly in the Baltic and Northern Europe, not to diminish their importance either. This is clearly changing, as Dr. Puglisi noted, and I'll touch upon a bit later in my remarks. So let me turn to our conclusions first about Russian strategy, and then come back to discuss a countervailing Western strategy and how that might unfold. First of all, it was striking to us that, and I worked with a number of our Russia experts, Moscow doesn't really have a single Black Sea strategy or strategy document, certainly as it does with the Arctic or other critical regions. Nevertheless, it's clear from a number of foundational documents and statements that the Black Sea is the intersection of several core Russian concerns and a critical nexus of defending the Russian homeland, maintaining a sphere of influence, and projecting power into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Countries close to Russia's borders are considered, first of all, of course, integral to the country's security. Russia and Georgia, first of all, to include the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which of course Russia refers to as allies, form the innermost circle of concern. But Moscow also strives to maintain leverage over Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and to limit the development of their ties to the West. Russia is seeking in this process, of course, to attain a sphere of influence or privileged influence in the Black Sea, perhaps exclusive, through informational, diplomatic, economic, energy, clandestine, and military instruments. And we examine a number of these as we can in that report. And it also uses these tools to foster divisions among NATO allies and to thwart what they see as anti-Russian policies. Russia uses hybrid tactics when overt military action is too costly or risky. Intelligence operatives, special forces, military personnel, and private contractors have, of course, engaged in irregular warfare in Ukraine since 2014. But conventional military capabilities provide the essential underpinning for achieving Russia's regional goals in the region. And here I'll echo some of the points that Dr. Aydin and others have talked about already about the shifting military balance. Russia's military buildup in Crimea, the modernization of the Black Sea Fleet and the Caspian Flotilla, and the increased ground forces in the Southern Military District are designed to secure Russia's vital southwestern flank from attack, dissuade and intimidate neighbors, and support wider power projection. The Black Sea Fleet has received new priority in the 2011-2020 State Armaments Program, which includes 6 new submarines, 3 frigates, and other smaller surface vessels. However, there have been significant procurement delays. Long-range strike capabilities have grown and, of course, were demonstrated at various points in the conflict in Syria, but we note that individual platforms have limited salvos. The State Armaments Program for 2027 calls for qualitative improvements, but a quantitative decline in forces given budget constraints. It includes 5 corvettes and up to 12 small ships, some with long-range strike capability. So it's not necessarily a force capable of operating far beyond Russia's border, but certainly one for exercising influence and intimidation within its near periphery. In the annexation of Crimea, Russia recovered a small fraction of the Soviet Union's strategic air defense space, and Crimea now provides a 2-echelon outer layer of defense against air attack emanating from the Eastern Mediterranean. Russia's coastal defense brigades perform, if they perform as designed in contested environment, pose a significant threat to hostile maritime forces within range. Russia has, however, limited warfighting capabilities for large-scale operations in either the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean, in our view. Changes to ground force posture provide the ability to move large combat units rapidly into Ukraine, and available and planned forces will certainly be able to deal with the most likely contingencies in the Caucasus and Ukraine. Now, of course, a critical question we considered was, what is the threshold for Russia employing forces in and against non-NATO countries adjacent to Russia? And we concluded that it is obviously and demonstrably fairly low. Nevertheless, Ukraine's containment of Russia's military incursion into eastern Ukraine and the West's response, including painful economic sanctions on Russia's entities and military assistance and Western military assistance to Ukraine, might have increased that threshold. Though through non-military and often non-military means, perhaps military means, Russia will oppose any formal political or military integration with the West by the countries along its periphery. Russia perceives any sort of losing an ally as a cause, potentially as a casus belli, but this is not always, and the Soviet Union before it, but this has not always led to a military intervention, we know. Nonetheless, any adverse change in the political status of Russian interest is a reliable, though insufficient, indicator of possible Russian military intervention in the Black Sea region. But NATO's anticipated response would be a significant factor. Now, let me turn to the perspectives of allies and partners in the region. We start first with the three NATO allies in the region, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. And as Dr. Triantafylou noticed, there's been much in flux, and Dr. Aydin noticed there's hardly a unified view among those 3 allies, and we note that as well. Romania, of course, is the most wary of Russia's intentions and military capabilities, and nevertheless, although it is largely resistant to malign influence, it also gives high priority to countering Russian hybrid threats and other kinds of malign influence. Bulgaria is certainly committed to Western integration, but is subject to various Western influences, which often leads it to balance relations between Moscow and the West. Turkey is key, as I fully agree with Dr. Aydin and others, and it still values the NATO guarantee, but it is clearly willing to impede allied initiatives in the region and is systematically balancing relations between Russia and the West, which has limited NATO's options and particularly additional measures that might be taken. So the Romanian government favors a more robust US and NATO military presence. Bulgarians are reluctant, but possibly might support selective additional presence. And the Turks seem at this point still somewhat hesitant about any further military presence, still fearing a damage to relations with Russia at a precarious time, and believe, I think somewhat mistakenly, or at least certainly some Turkish officials seem to believe, that they can still manage Black Sea security cooperatively, or perhaps largely on their own with Moscow. The strategies of the other 5 countries in the region, of course, are shaped by varying interests and concerns. Ukraine and Georgia, of course, committed to Western integration, deeper defense cooperation, but they're constrained by the active armed conflicts. Moldova, of course, a divided government that was seeking a middle road between Russia and the West before reorienting toward Moscow last year. But it has nonetheless contributed to Western exercises and welcomes support in the military, on its military reforms. Armenia, of course, is, as we see, heavily dependent, even in these recent weeks, dependent on Russian security patronage, but remains open to diplomatic and limited security cooperation with the West. And finally, Azerbaijan, of course, is pursuing a practical, measured sort of approach to Russia and the West, but can play a critical role in reducing Southern Europe's reliance on Russian energy. So let me turn in the time that remains quickly to our recommendations. First of all, we argue that a collective strategy for the region and a plan for Western engagement must consider assessments of Moscow's red lines, asymmetries in interests between Russia and our allies and partners in the region, and military capabilities, as well as the risk tolerance that particularly of our allies and partners. Moscow's red lines are not known with precision and may shift over time, as they did when Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova signed association agreements with the European Union. Nevertheless, we think a sustainable Western strategy to counter Western aggression, protect common interests, and foster regional stability could include some of the following measures. First of all, we argue on the informational side, selective and proactive responses to Russian influence measures, highlighting the benefits of Western integration, are likely to be more effective than seeking to discredit pervasive false narratives. Redoubled European Union and NATO efforts to help countries in the Black Sea region counter these diverse threats, informational, cyber, economic, clandestine, all can play an important role and needs indeed for that kind of combined transatlantic strategy and Euro-Atlantic strategy. Strong support for compliance with international laws, and some of this was touched on in the first panel, and including the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, the Montreux Convention, to assure freedom of navigation and contribute to economic development and regional stability, as we're reminded in the Russian activities against Ukrainian efforts to transit the Kerch Strait a few years ago. Finally, we talk about the need for a more robust conventional deterrent posture beyond NATO's tailored forward presence, although it need not match Russian capabilities. It could include expanded US and NATO rotational deployments of ground and air forces, as well as naval presence and exercises. As some of you and many of you have noticed, Secretary of Defense Esper announced in July that certain US Army units will begin continuous rotations in the Black Sea region, and some fighter aircraft repositioned to Italy will undertake dynamic force employments and rotational deployments to enhance deterrence and reassure allies in Southeastern Europe. So I think this is a positive development. Further integration of existing maritime activities and capabilities was touched upon this morning also by Lieutenant General Hodges, and his suggestion about integrating various regional exercises that go underway separately on the Western side seem definitely worth exploring. Plus, we think that perhaps the exploration of deployment of advanced air and coastal defense systems in Romania and possibly Bulgaria to counter Russian missile threats might be warranted. Lastly, continued security assistance to strengthen partner resilience against hybrid threats and self-defense capability, backed by allied cohesion, which can also temper Russian aggression, as we've seen in Georgia since 2008 and Ukraine since 2014. And finally, we should look at more effective and flexible multilateral partnerships and existing mechanisms for sub-regional cooperation, including some that have sort of fallen into disuse, such as the Southeast European Defense Ministerial process, but also other kinds of ad hoc measures. So thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go over time, but I was trying to keep my clock here. Thank you, Rosario.
Thank you very much. I mean, there are so many points that are already emerging. It would be very difficult to keep us online straight for the remaining of the conversation. So let me run immediately to Dr. Michael Carpenter from the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rosario. So I will be brief. I would like to move away a little bit from the balance of power analysis that, that at least some of the panelists have used, and really focus on, sort of zoom out and focus on what I think is the overarching dynamic in the Black Sea region. And that is essentially, if you see the 21st century geopolitics as I do, as essentially a clash between liberal democracy and authoritarian oligarchy, you see the tectonic plates of the European area of liberal democracies clashing with the Eurasian area of authoritarian oligarchies, sort of happening right exactly in the Black Sea region. And you have had a number of conflicts erupt as a result of that clash, including Russia's invasion of Georgia, of course, in 2008, but also its invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And I think this frame is a little bit more helpful in terms of understanding what is happening. If you compare, for example, the Baltic Sea Basin with the Black Sea Basin, you'll see that the two seas are of comparable size, in fact, remarkably similar. They have a similar number of littoral states, slightly more in the Baltic than in the Black Sea. You have a mix of NATO members and non-NATO members in both cases. And in both cases, you have Russia, a great power with a very capable naval fleet headquartered in both areas, the Baltic fleet in Baltijsk, and of course, the Black Sea fleet in Crimea. And yet, you couldn't really find two regions that are more different in terms of resilience, in terms of deterrence, conventional as well as non-conventional, and the geopolitical dynamics that surround that. So in the Baltic Sea region, you have fairly robust, effective conventional deterrence, as well as nuclear deterrence. You have very high levels of societal resilience across the entire region. And among many of the states in the Baltic Basin, you have the adherence to a total defense concept, where societal resilience and military resilience are integrated, and you have a number of different layers of defense against both hybrid threats, conventional threats, disinformation, and other forms of financial sort of malified or malign influence operations, and so on and so forth. In the Black Sea region, you have very, very different situation where Russia essentially acts with impunity. You have much lower levels of resilience. Just look at the trends towards authoritarian oligarchy in places like Bulgaria, Moldova, contemporary Ukraine, I'm sorry to say, and many other states in the region. You also have high prevalence of conflicts in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, Donbass, Crimea, and of course, Nagorno-Karabakh. And so just completely different geopolitical circumstances based on different factors, but based fundamentally on this conflict between liberal democracy and authoritarian oligarchy, and the influence of the latter, especially in the Black Sea Basin. Very high degree of instability. As one of the speakers remarked, US withdrawal from the region, generally speaking, over the course of the last few years, but you could even go back further and say that US has not been as active in the region as it had been in the past. And you have, therefore, with this sort of power vacuum, you have various different outside players coming in and trying to assert their influence, to include, of course, Russia. Turkey is, of course, a Black Sea state, but it's certainly amplifying its influence, especially in the South Caucasus. You have China trying to make economic inroads across the region, certainly in Georgia, in Turkey, in Bulgaria, in Romania, and other places, in Ukraine. And so this instability has resulted in the fact that the Black Sea is essentially a contested space where Russia seeks regional dominance, Turkey seeks to a certain degree its own regional dominance, and you have this divide between the Western and the Eastern Black Sea littoral states. So you have NATO space, NATO EU space on the Western side, and then this sort of murky gray zone on the other side that is taken advantage of by Russia, China, Iran, I should have mentioned, and others. And so what this means is that going forward, NATO really has to play, NATO and the EU, I would say, have to play a much more aggressive, assertive role in terms of advancing their interests, trying to strengthen the resilience of the countries in this region, putting in place some of the measures that Steve just talked about in terms of conventional deterrence, force posture, more exercising a more robust standing maritime presence in the Black Sea, ideally composed of NATO nations like Romania and Bulgaria cooperating to increase the number of ships that they have that are headquartered in the Black Sea, but then also more visits from other non-Black Sea NATO members who come in for regular rotations and exercises and so on and so forth. As important as that, however, is increasing resilience and trying to work with the countries of the region to boost their capacity to withstand the non-military threats to their territorial integrity. And we've seen in the case of Georgia, Russia has both used what I called financial influence operations, funding allegedly the Alliance of Patriots Party, which is a pro-Russian party in Georgia, using disinformation against the West, against the United States and its interests. We've seen this repeatedly in places like Georgia and places like Moldova, in Romania, in Bulgaria, and the pushback, the sort of the indigenous capacity of these countries to push back against this sort of interference is limited, frankly, as evidenced by the fact that the Alliance of Patriots essentially acts unchecked in the Georgian political space, and a lot of its financial and other personnel ties to Russia essentially go unchallenged. And so, again, this calls for greater NATO involvement, but also greater EU involvement in order to try to box out this malign influence, in order to try to check the influence of China with its Belt and Road initiative. There is not a countervailing initiative from the EU or from a coalition of NATO EU members to invest in critical infrastructure in the region, despite the fact that it's vital to East-West trade and communications. There is not a coordinated effort that is anywhere near comparable to what we have with Belt and Road that seeks to capitalize on Western investors' interest in profits in this region in order to try to secure the critical infrastructure and to enhance it, strengthen it, so that it is not a node of Chinese influence, but it is perhaps a way to tie the eastern and western sides of the Black Sea together for the benefit of all. And so, I think we have to sort of step back, look at the region holistically, and think geopolitically about how to empower especially those actors that are fighting against authoritarian oligarchy, because that's fundamentally what this is about. And we have to work, I think the next administration is going to have to work much harder on its Turkey policy to get Turkey, which is of course a vital player in this region, to play a more collaborative role with its Western allies, its formal NATO allies, precisely to push back against authoritarian oligarchy and to help its fellow democracies to expand their influence in a positive way in the region, right? And right now there is no Turkey strategy that I can tell this administration has, other than President Trump's own financial interests in Turkey, which have led him to essentially to work with the Erdogan regime, but not to really have any sort of a strategy for cooperation in the region. And you look at the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, which just illustrates exactly what happens when the U.S. steps back, when the U.S. is not willing to expend just simply the diplomatic capital, never mind the economic the military capital to be able to play a role. And so obviously when the US steps back, France is, as a Minsk group co-chair country, is engaged, but is far away, does not have a lot of levers of influence. So essentially the influence for Russia and Turkey is left unchecked. And I personally believe that the war in Karabakh is that it's not going to be easy to put the genie back in the bottle. I think what we're seeing will last for years, not in terms of the actual military conflict on the ground, but what we're seeing now is the sort of definitive, I think, death of the Madrid Principles, which were a concept developed over a decade ago by the Minsk group co-chairs that put on the table a solution that was workable, but that now with the increased hostility between the two sides, Azerbaijan's now control, potentially if things continue on this track that they are right now, of the strategic heights in the north, in the occupied territories just outside of Nagorno-Karabakh proper, overlooking the communications link between Vardenis and Mardikert. That will change the entire dynamic of the conflict and will make a solution like the one proposed by the co-chair countries a decade ago in the Madrid Principles no longer feasible. And that means going back to the drawing board, and it just means that the situation is rife for continued conflict and precisely for the influence of these outside powers. So bottom line, to wrap up here, this is a larger geopolitical set of issues that are brought to bear in this region. And the only way NATO and the EU can be more effective is if they are more united and they actually have a strategy that is coherent that they can implement to push back on the influence of authoritarian oligarchy. Thanks.
Many thanks, Mike. And I'll move immediately to our next speaker, who's Mr. Bruno Lete from the Security and Defense Program at the German Marshall Fund. Thank you.
Hi, Rosaria, and good evening, everyone from sunny Brussels. I think the benefits of going last is that my colleagues on the panel already did all the hard work and said all the important things. So I can keep my presentation pretty short, actually. I would like to make 5 very concrete points. Point 1, thanks to the annexation of Crimea, yes, Russia is once again a dominant power in the Black Sea, but today that power is still too weak to sufficiently challenge NATO presence or to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake. So in the near future, I don't think we'll return to a geopolitical situation as it was during the Soviet Union, where Russia exerted a de facto hegemony over the region. However, the annexation of Crimea did substantially increase Russian power, and that has implications for all the littoral states, Georgia as well. And the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula also meant that Russia now shares a direct maritime border with 3 NATO member states, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. So the risk for military incidents increases. So I would like to say there that, in short, if NATO wants to improve the security situation in the Black Sea region, part of the answer is really to find a solution for Crimea. Insisting on the non-recognition policy is essential here. Of course, Crimea is not an endpoint. There are also frozen conflicts all across the Black Sea to be resolved. Actually, these are not so frozen at all. There are times where they're pretty heated up. But it really is from Crimea, more than from any other zone that Russia occupies, that Moscow has been building up military assets, A2AD functions, etc. Contain Crimea and Moscow's power will probably go back 5 years in time. Point number 2. Yes, Russia may not exert total dominance over the Black Sea, but its power is strong enough to prevent NATO from imposing its own deterrence in the region. And yes, this is due to Russia's powerful presence, but I would also argue, and I agree with what the speaker said before, I would argue that NATO lacks a bit of a coherent strategy for the Black Sea. Now, NATO is doing a lot, and the attention for the region has certainly improved over the past years. But there's an absence of coherence, just like Mike said. The Allied strategy for the Black Sea looks a bit more like a patchwork, pieces of puzzle scattered across the board. Again, if you compare to what NATO is doing in the Baltics, you could argue that NATO is less prepared in the Black Sea. Its presence is limited to setting up a series of deterrence measures to prove that NATO is able to operate in the region. And Rosalia, you mentioned a few of those. The problem, however, that these measures are designed to work well in peacetime, but it would nearly be impossible for NATO to sustain these measures in wartime. Again, unlike the Baltics, NATO in the Black Sea has no B plan if fighting would be required. So that's important to keep in mind. And also beyond the military, we also see a bit of incoherence at the political level, especially to partners. There, for instance, I would just like to say that it's important to create linkages between NATO policies, such as the NATO military strategy that was adopted in 2019, the new military strategy. And for instance, what NATO is doing with the NATO-Ukraine partnership or the substantial NATO-Georgia package, there must be linkages between all these initiatives, and perhaps that's also a little bit absent today. Point 3, the European Union. Now, actually, the EU is doing a lot of good things in the region when it comes to mediation, or for instance, to increase the resilience of Black Sea countries against hybrid warfare. The EU is de facto also the biggest aid provider to certain important friends and partners in the region, Ukraine or Georgia. Think also, for instance, about the immense scope of the EU's Eastern Partnership Program. It's very active in the Black Sea region. I think earlier someone said that the European Union presence decreased in the Black Sea. So here I would like to stand up maybe for Brussels and respectively, say that actually I think EU is doing more nowadays in the region. The big problem, however, is that we do not know yet how the role of Europe as a security actor will evolve. There are more uncertainties than certitudes. So right now, keeping a strong transatlantic and American presence in the region is the best guarantee for security. That's my third point. Think transatlantic when you think about the Black Sea region. I'm sure we all watched how the EU struggled to be able to impose sanctions on Belarus. I mean, it took the bloc 5 weeks to achieve unanimity on a pretty straightforward issue, sanctioning a dictator. But it's not the first time, of course, that we see that the EU struggles to take decisions. And the Black Sea region is no exception to that. Only when Europeans will start to agree on how they see the threats of the Black Sea region, only then, they may agree to do more about the issues. And the EU will become a stronger security partner for countries such as Georgia or Ukraine. So I would like to say to all my Georgian friends, don't put all your Las Vegas bets on Brussels. The transatlantic link will remain essential for a foreseeable while to come in the region. And EU-NATO cooperation may matter in this respect. But my time is too short to elaborate more on that. My fourth point, I would also like to say a very short thing on Turkey. I would like to argue that Turkish influence in the Black Sea has declined. That's because I think Turkey pursues desires that are difficult to combine. It's to pursue its own regional ambitions, its NATO commitments. There's a necessity to accommodate Russia. So because of all that, it has proven very difficult for Turkey to articulate its interests in the Black Sea region. So I think Ankara's long-term interests will be to continue to balance Russia's growing military posture in the Black Sea. And a tool to do that is, for instance, like our colleague said, to promote multilateral cooperation in the region. That I think will be definitely a key aspect of what Turkey will do in the near to midterm. And then I promise to be short, dear Rosalia, a very last point, point 5. And this is actually something beyond big political and military strategy here, but I think it's very important. And this is something that we as NGOs and academics can do very concretely. And that's to keep the Black Sea on the agenda. Keep talking about it, keep organizing events, publish as much analysis as you can, post your opinions on social media, do all that, but we need to create attention for the Black Sea. We cannot allow our political leaders and military to lose focus for the threats emerging from this region. That region is just too crucial to Europe as a whole. So we have to fight the so-called fatigue or lack of attention in key capitals such as Washington or Brussels or Berlin. And that is something that all of us here can easily do. So building more security for the Black Sea is also about keeping it on the agenda of high politics. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Bruno, for being so punctual and precise. This will give us enough time for a little bit of a conversation, even though we have, we should have concluded already now, because we have a bunch of students who are looking forward to present the conclusions of the workshop today. So I have only one question from participants in our seminar. But maybe I'll just say something before that. I mean, first of all, I really want to thank everyone for their capacity to bring in a number of different issues. We've moved from the geopolitical dimension to discussing the flux or the transformations in the current world from multilateralism to multipolaralism. We have looked at the clashes between liberal democracies and authoritarian oligarchies. We have looked at the role of individual countries, like, of course, Turkey, which is central. And this is actually the matter of the question, of the single question that we have, that I will raise in a moment. We have heard calls for to strengthen the transatlantic connection, which is the only way to counterbalance malign external influences. I think we all agree, at least on this point. I would just like to have one word, a very quick word from all of you on actually the impact that you think the current hostilities in Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, of course, the issue has been addressed by a number of you, but do you think that this will have, would the fight at the moment will have a long-term impact on the wider kind of stability and the perspective of partnership in what we have called the wider Black Sea region? And then I will add also the question of our member of the public, which is, let me read it. What is Turkey's position if NATO or a major NATO non-Black Sea country decides to increase their maritime presence in the Eastern Black Sea? Do we expect an increased defense maritime cooperation with Georgia? So I think these are the 2 points that we can use to draw our conclusions. And if you don't mind, I would give maybe just really 1 minute each, following maybe the opposite cycle that we have followed so far. So Bruno, would you mind going first?
Yeah, I can respond to your question on Nagorno-Karabakh. I think the implications of that conflict are, hard to predict. No one has a glass ball here. But yeah, I also agree with Michael. It's here to stay for a while. The only immediate implication I do see, Rosaria, and I like to be brief and to the point, is that if Turkish and Western interests diverge in that conflict, that may pose additional challenges for a relationship that is already under strain. That's the only immediate political problem that I could be able to perceive, and that would have implication then for the Black Sea as well, for instance, in platforms such as NATO.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mike, your turn.
So I'll be very brief. Yes, I think it's going to have lasting influence, and only in a negative way. I alluded to the basic principles developed by the co-chairs, also known as the Madrid Principles, which I was then an advisor to the US co-chair of the Minsk group when those were developed. In fact, they were developed on my laptop in Madrid, which is why they have the name Madrid Principles. Those envisioned a gradual deoccupation of the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh in return for a number of steps regarding the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. At this point in time, envisioning Armenia and the Karabakhi authorities voluntarily deoccupying those 7 regions, Lachin and Kelbajar and so on and so forth, that surround Karabakh, it is unthinkable. And similarly, on the Azerbaijani side, you know, they have waited so long for these principles to be adopted without any positive movement at all, that from their perspective, the 4-day war 4 years ago showed that this is really the only way for them to gain a strategic advantage and to begin to deoccupy these regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. So unfortunately, I think this sets the conflict on a very dangerous path where the two sides see that military confrontation is the only way, military confrontation and occupation are the only way to achieve their security aims. And that's bad going forward.
Thank you, Mike. Stephen.
Thank you. Briefly on Nagorno-Karabakh, I think that perhaps the one effect will be, it's difficult to get attention to much of anything that's not related to domestic politics in the United States right now, but I do think that it will be a reminder, certainly to people shaping the next agenda of the next administration, of the potential for continuing conflict in the region and why the region matters. And I think it also underscores Bruno's point about the need for some kind of mechanisms. I didn't have time to touch on it, but some kind of a diplomatic strategy, not only for solving the other conflicts, this one and the other conflicts in the region, but also some kind of engagement for crisis management. It takes two to tango, and Russia's been reluctant, but I do think the potential for further clashes and incidents is great. And then quickly, I defer to our two colleagues in Istanbul, but I think it's unclear what Turkey's stance would be. Turkey has continued to contribute to the NATO enhanced, the tailored forward presence in military personnel that hasn't certainly stopped any exercises that NATO and the US multilateral exercises that have taken place in the region, but I don't know how far they're willing to go. So I'd be interested to hear our Turkish colleagues on that, or our colleagues in Istanbul, I should say, on that.
Thank you. Mustafa, I think you have a chance on this. Thanks. And you need to unmute.
Regarding the Nagorno-Karabakh, I agree with all our colleagues that the only negative aspects I can imagine coming out of this conflict as far as the security of the Black Sea is concerned. And it will be even more difficult if Turkey and Russia somehow get involved. But even if they are not really involved on the ground, this frozen conflict is one of the biggest problems of stability in the Black Sea, and Nagorno-Karabakh is the most intricate of those frozen conflicts. So I don't see any positive contribution. Regarding the NATO and the Black Sea, I think the question is about when the question says maritime presence, I understood to increase maritime presence of non-Black Sea countries in the Black Sea region, Black Sea itself. That, of course, from the Turkish perspective, is governed by the Montreux Convention, and Turkey is very scrupulous of applying that convention. So I don't see any real scenario unless there is a open and clear warfare between Russia and Turkey, that Turkey would allow more non-Black Sea countries naval presence in the Black Sea. However, the maneuvers and other operations with NATO countries in the Black Sea would continue, of course, provided that they would comply with the Montreux Convention. I don't see any other possibility that Turkey would allow willingly violation of Montreux Convention, even during the highest part of the Cold War, when Turkey felt increased Russian threats. Turkey did not allow the violation of that convention.
Thank you very much. Dimitris, you have the concluding remarks.
Well, thanks. I mean, regarding the second question, I think it's sort of been answered by Mustafa. I don't think I have anything else to add regarding that. Regarding the first one, I mean, it's interesting, paradoxically, the fact that the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh is happening now, a month away from a US presidential election, and the potential, the very real potential of a new administration coming in, Biden presidency with people like Mike on board and others, and the freshness of that administration to actually do something might be good in trying to spur the alliance and the allies to action to try to create a more cohesive policy towards the Black Sea. So in that sense, developments on the ground are what they are. I agree with the failure of the Madrid Principles and the Minsk Group and so on, but I mean, it might be an opportunity now with the new administration coming in to refocus on the region. That's all.
Thank you to everyone for really kind of thoughtful considerations, and we're all kind of waiting for the next developments. And I think this is the moment actually to leave it to the students who have been battling with scenarios, artificial scenarios, but they may one day have to find themselves facing the practical, concrete crisis we have been discussing today. Thank you very much. Your contribution has been really appreciated. Thank you, and have a nice evening, afternoon, rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Once again, let me welcome you, all the panelists in attendance of the conference. I am, as a member of the School of Social Science of the University of Georgia, I'm more than pleased to announce the completion of the conference. I'm totally happy with the objectives reached during the conference, with the conclusions we've been able to draw during our panel discussions, And I'm also happy to announce that we, as you know, in a parallel sessions, students across the leading Georgian universities, they've been hard working on the tabletop exercise in which they tried to analyze escalation scenario, a kind of scenario that is very relevant to Georgian security situation. And actually, we have been discussing this scenario during the conference. The students will present their findings, their conclusions, their analysis, and that was one of the major objectives of the conference, to allow our students, along with the panelists and other participants of the conference, to participate in being able to analyze the real political decision-making. Once again, thank you very much for your participation, efforts, and see you next time with the University of Georgia Annual Conference. Thank you very much.
Hello, dear participants, dear panelists. It's great honor for me to be the part of this great phenomenon, this political military simulation, which was held by the NATO liaison office in the University of Georgia. We'll now briefly inform you about the key issues of the scenario which was extended on Georgia. And we will briefly say the key objectives and results we've achieved among our teams. So there were 6 parties in Geneva, which was organized by you, with Georgia, Russia, so-called South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and now Salome will introduce you about the details, key objectives, and main findings of the simulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. According to the scenario, in September, the situation between Georgia and so-called Abkhazia has escalated and began a military conflict between these two sides. And because of that, many people died in the conflict area. And EU started a negotiation process in Geneva, and every team had their own goals to achieve, and every delegation tried to negotiating which is each other, and we already have a result, so which we achieved today. For Georgia, Georgia approach to set international maintenance from US, EU, and international security organizations, and agreed to provide Abkhazia with electricity. However, the main goal, which was ceasefire agreement, was not achieved, and the military conflict will still continues, and ceasefire agreement was not achieved, and this is our whole result in our game and today. Thank you.